to Get Down to Business, the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. I am honored and thrilled to have the Pennsylvania Secretary of Banking and Securities, Richard Vague, join me here on Get Down to Business. Prior to his 2020 appointment, he was the managing partner of a venture capital company, co-founder, chairman, and CEO of an electricity and natural gas company, and co-founder and CEO of two national consumer banks. But most importantly, perhaps, his new book is an illustrated business history of the United States. So, Richard, welcome to the program.
It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, I want to talk about the background for this book. We certainly know that right now the U.S. House is contending with a $1 trillion bill promoted by President Biden to upgrade the country's infrastructure. And in the meantime, we certainly look at the lines between the United States government and business, and it is as blurry as it comes. So, Richard, I know you've studied that topic both through history, and the book is a fascinating read. So, I'm curious, what led you to spend all the time? It certainly sounds like you've been busy. Spend all that time in writing an illustrated business history of the United States.
Well, we were doing a lot of research on financial crises in a book that we published a couple of years ago. And we pushed that analysis back a couple of hundred years in the six biggest countries on earth, which, of course, is topped by the United States. And as we were doing that, we found that a lot of business data was unavailable when you came to the late 1700s and the early 1800s, really throughout the 1800s. So we noticed there had not been a business history written, and we felt like that was a challenge to us to fill that void.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is that we just lived through another crisis, but we've had a lot of different crises over times. And what I love about the book, and again, it's an illustrated business history. So, I mean, even from the cover onward, you see some of that lens of how real estate, finance, agriculture, industry, other sectors, how there is a story that has been told. So, Richard, I have to ask, what's your most interesting story that you had the most fun sort of learning about yourself?
Well, the U.S. government, as you alluded to in your earlier comments, was deeply involved in business from the very beginning. So we see them teaching manufacturers how to do interchangeable parts in the American Revolution, financing some of that activity. And then to answer your question, right after that, we desired to start a manufacturing industry within the United States. But all that knowledge and all those secrets are over in Britain. So we basically have to steal those secrets. And there's a lot of individuals involved, but they are aided and abetted by some of the most prominent names in American history in terms of stealing Britain's IP. You know, Alexander Hamilton, Tench Coxe, and others were deeply involved in that. So I think I had a lot of fun looking at what the U.S. government was doing in the early decades.
The role of government in business, certainly it's played a very substantial role. And I know, Richard, I talked about your background a moment ago, and you've been in leadership roles in the banking industry for a while. So what's that role of banks been in business throughout time?
Well, it's fascinating because my own knowledge as a practitioner really didn't go back past World War II. So I kind of assumed, I think as many people do, that perhaps banks that weren't significant prior in the early period of American history. But banks are involved in a major way from the very beginning. In fact, the very first bank in the U.S. is formed in 1781 to help finance the Revolution. We all know that the Continentals were inflationary. So a bunch of patriots formed a bank called the Bank of North America and helped finance some of the supplies that helped win the Battle of Yorktown, which of course was the last major battle of the war. Then that's almost immediately followed by the establishment of the Bank of the United States in 1791. So you have massive banks dominating the landscape from the very outset. By the time a couple of decades have passed, you have 300 or 400 banks in the United States, and it's the dominant early industry.
Fascinating. Again, I'm chatting with Richard Vague, who is currently serving as the Pennsylvania Banking and Securities Secretary, but certainly with a very, very rich history in business. And that is indeed the topic of the book, An Illustrated Business History of the United States. So lastly, before we go to a very quick break, I want to talk about how real estate factors into U.S. history. I think we all know that right now there's that real estate boom that's taking place, but that history of real estate is really kind of fascinating, isn't it?
It's very fascinating to learn that I kind of look at 1748 as an epical moment in the North American continent. Very young George Washington, in his early 20s, and his two older brothers and several other wealthy Virginians form the Ohio Company of Virginia to try to buy 500,000 acres in the Ohio Valley. And that's really sets off, a multi-decade run where the rich folks in the United States are trying to buy vast tracts of land. Robert Morris accumulates 6 million acres of land. Robert, of course, helped finance the revolution itself when he was the first financial executive in the U.S. Of course, it led him to bankruptcy. But you have any number of other folks. William Bingham, who's the richest man in America in that era, amasses several million acres. It's America's first business.
Well, very, very interesting. So I know you are a historian. You've written the author of A Brief History of Doom, The Next Economic Disaster. Lots of interesting reads, but this book is certainly fascinating indeed. It is the Illustrated Business History of the United States. We've got to squeeze in a very quick break, but when we come back, I do want to continue our conversation with Richard Veig in talking about what's fundamentally changed about business and what's the future of business. Certainly timely as we wrap up this 2021 year that's been all sorts of fun. So again, quick break and more with Richard Veig when we return in just a moment. Hey, well, welcome back. I've been chatting with Richard Veig. We've been chatting about the Illustrated Business History of the United States. We're going to share that website where you can find this just fascinating read that came out back in May of 2021, and I've been enjoying it immensely. And we've been chatting about the role of government, role of banks, role of real estate in U.S. history. And certainly that all leads into what I know is so near and dear to all of our listeners on Get Down to Business, and that's business itself, small business perhaps. So Richard, I know in your research and certainly in your current role, you pay close attention to business. What's fundamentally changed about business over time in our U.S. history?
The thing that you note when you look at business over the last 250 years is that our largest businesses are invariably associated with the practical needs of life: agriculture, transportation, energy, and the like. And that's really been true up until the very recent past. And all of a sudden, we're beginning to see, as the United States has become more wealthy and more of our time is spent in entertainment type pursuits, we're seeing the emergence to the very top of the list of American businesses, businesses like Facebook that are not involved in the practical needs of life, but instead revolve around entertainment, controversy, the things that consume, kind of the idle hours of our lives. And we're seeing other companies emerge. Things like Netflix and Amazon are certainly more and more associated with video streaming and things like that. I think it's a fundamental change in U.S. business. I think in the future, business is going to be more and more represented by businesses that have to do with comfort, controversy, distraction, entertainment, as opposed to those practical needs.
Fascinating. So, Richard, again, we're having this conversation in mid-November 2021, where we've certainly seen a lot of changes. So you sort of just led into that about the future of business and where you're seeing it. You talked about some of the entertainment technology and so on. But if there's one thing that you're seeing, and perhaps one bit of advice that you have for our small business and entrepreneur listeners out there, what would that be?
Well, it's pay attention to the future. I mean, I see a lot of changes going on. Two of the biggest, one I already mentioned, which is kind of our digital future. We're going to be the metaverse, augmented reality, virtual reality are going to consume more and more of our time. Another profound change that is just beginning to emerge is genetic engineering. it's going to bring an unprecedented revolution. We're able to use it for things like disease cure, but over the longer term, we're going to be able to use it to re-engineer ourselves. Now, I can see vanity changes in our own DNA, and this is going to be a huge industry. So if you're a small business starting out, I'd look to industries that are going to be the big industries and try to latch on to serving those industries.
Well, I've certainly learned a lot from our conversation with author Richard Vega. I could use so many other titles as well, and you're just continuing to serve and certainly use that business background in the currently in the world of government, but certainly looking at history as a way to predict the future is certainly the way to go. So the book is called An Illustrated Business History of the United States, published by University of Pennsylvania Press in May of 2021. And I want to make sure our listeners know where they can learn more about you, because I have a feeling there's probably more books to come. So Richard, can you share your website?
It's my name, which is Richard Vague, V as in Victor, AGUE.com. And we have my books and other data about the economy on that site.
RichardVague.com. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I appreciate you joining us and sharing how, that illustrated business history of the United States for the first time, really documenting that. So I really enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to staying in touch. That's a wrap here for us on Get Down to Business, the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. Get on my website, shalomklein.com. That's where you can download podcasts from the 8+ years of shows to success. Let's get down to business. We'll talk to you next Sunday at 6 p.m. right here on 956 The Answer.